3 women vanish without a trace, investigators comb for clues and find themselves on the trail of a savvy serial killer. Without witnesses, detectives are at a total loss to find a missing woman. To solve this case requires an act of God. When a woman disappears from under her own roof, investigators suspect that she was murdered. But getting to the bottom of it will require some sophisticated technology. Most murder investigations begin with a body. But when the body is missing, detectives face the ultimate challenge: catching a killer when the victim is presumed dead.
Tips hotline.
It was a Monday, June 19, 1989, when police in the Kansas City suburb of Overland Park, Kansas, received a call from worried parents. Their daughter, 24-year-old Joan Butler, hadn't shown up for work that morning. She hadn't even phoned in. No one had seen her since early the day before.
That's interesting because...
Though she had been gone just over 24 hours, her parents were convinced something terrible must have happened to prevent her from contacting anyone.
And in the town that he grew up in,
Police agreed to check on her.
that's a small town.
When investigators searched Joan's apartment with one of her friends, they found no sign of her. And according to Detective Pat Hinkle, no sign that she planned on being away.
No bags had been packed. Her makeup was still around the sink. No clothing appeared to have been removed from the apartment, so the only thing missing was Joan.
They learned that Joan had spent Saturday night with her girlfriends.
Yeah, I do. They're great.
At 4 a.m. Sunday, she went home.
Have you? That explains it. Thanks again. I'll call you tomorrow.
That was the last time they saw her. Joan Butler wasn't the kind of person to leave without a word. She saw her parents at least once a week and socialized often with her friends. She wouldn't miss work without good reason. In her apartment, her friend pointed out to police the clothes Joan was last seen wearing, so she had definitely made it home. But her purse, wallet, and her car were missing. By roll call Tuesday morning, the mystery had deepened. A check of Butler's bank account revealed that $300, the daily maximum, had been withdrawn from an ATM at 6 a.m. Sunday, just 2 hours after she was last seen. It happened again early Monday and early Tuesday. All the ATMs were in the Kansas City area. None had video cameras. The pattern suggested that someone else was in control of Joan Butler's account, and maybe in control of Joan.
He had gone down and played, I don't know if you remember.
Her family and friends posted leaflets all over Kansas City, describing Joan and her car and pleading for help to find her. Her disappearance made the news, but turned up no leads. Until 1 week later. On June 25th, police got their first tip.
Sir, can I speak
Joan's
to you for a minute?
car had been spotted outside an apartment complex 40 miles from her home. The man with Joan's keys told the officer that he borrowed them from his buddy inside. The officer suggested they go in and sort things out. The suspect began to escort the officer inside, then took off. He caught the policeman by surprise and made an agile escape. The officer learned that the fugitive was a painting contractor named Ricky Cho, and the men were his crew. They also told him that Cho recently started driving a new red car, Joan Butler's car. When police examined the trunk, they discovered part of the carpet had been cut away. They also found a dark stain. They presumed it was Joan Butler's blood. According to Detective Hinkle, if that were the case, it would prove that she hadn't left of her own free will.
Any experienced officer would then suspect that possibly the trunk had been used for the storage of the person who belonged to the car, you know, the missing person.
Investigators couldn't be certain it was Joan's blood without having a sample from her to compare it to. They hoped a new forensic technique called reverse paternity could help them. It works on the theory that a person's DNA shares the same traits as the DNA of her parents. By taking a close look at both parents' DNA, investigators could estimate what their children's DNA might look like. Blood samples would have to be taken from Butler's mother and father. Then the DNA from the blood found in Joan Butler's car would be extracted and compared. The meticulous process would take weeks.
Unicorn.
While awaiting analysis of the stain, detectives ran a background check on Ricky Cho. The name turned out to be an alias, one of many. His real name was Richard Grissom. He was a 28-year-old ex-con with a rap sheet almost as old as he was.
His criminal background included a history of forgery, a history of auto theft, and a prior conviction of homicide in which he killed an elderly woman in the city of Leavenworth, Kansas.
He was charged as a juvenile in that crime and served only a few years before he was back on the street. Grissom's father was African American and his mother was Asian, giving him a striking combination of features that allowed him to drastically alter his appearance. Throughout a decade of crime and disguise, he had evaded capture. Police worked the equation: a young woman's sudden disappearance, a drained bank account, and a stolen car. Factor in a convicted killer named Richard Grissom, and the result pointed to kidnapping, possibly murder. If Joan Butler wasn't dead yet, investigators feared she soon would be. Police fanned out across Kansas City, interviewing friends and colleagues of Grissom, but no one admitted seeing him. After Joan Butler's bank account was emptied, her trail evaporated too. Investigators had no more leads. Then, on Monday, June 26th, David Roosh received a message that his daughter Christine was sick and wouldn't be coming into his optical lab where she worked. Later that day, Roosh went to her home to check on her. She wasn't there. Neither was her roommate, Teresa Brown, who had also called in sick. Christine's car was gone. Neither woman had checked into a hospital, and none of their friends had seen them. The women seemed to have simply vanished.
Good, Dave.
The next day, their families filed missing persons reports.
Hey, you're here.
Both women were well liked, with close families and friends.
Might go out tonight.
Don't think so.
Christine, age 22, enjoyed working at her dad's shop. Teresa, also 22, had saved enough money to enroll in college. Neither woman had any problems to speak of, and neither was the kind to shirk her responsibilities. Their behavior, like the mess in their home, was out of character. Detectives combed the apartment for clues. Their wallets were missing, but oddly, a curling iron was left on. It was all very disturbing, especially so soon after the disappearance of Joan Butler. Detectives collected hairs and fibers, including 2 dark hairs found in the roommate's bedding that didn't seem to belong to either woman. No blood was found in the apartment, no weapon, no sign of forced entry or struggle. In short, no evidence of a crime. The front door hadn't been forced. If there had been an intruder, it was either someone the women knew or someone with a key. It wasn't much of a case to hand District Attorney Paul Morrison.
We didn't have a crime scene here. What we had was a lot of different fragments, and so our task was to try to see what we could put together from that and build a scenario and piece together what we think happened.
Detectives learned that passkeys had been given to a painting company, Richard Grissom's painting company. What began as a missing persons case now looked like a spree of kidnappings. The day after police searched Christine and Teresa's apartment, Christine's abandoned car was found a few hundred yards from her home. On the driver's side fender were fresh flecks of blue paint, but inside they found no viable clues. Later, a check of the roommate's bank records showed another sinister parallel with Joan Butler. Their accounts were quickly drained through multiple transactions. But if investigators hoped to link Richard Grissom to the missing women, they'd need solid proof. It surfaced in the lab when the dark hairs found in the roommate's bedding were analyzed. The hairs proved to be of African Asian origin, like the suspect. That wasn't the only link. From Grissom's employees, police learned that he had rented a storage locker for his business. Detectives obtained a search warrant to have a look. Inside, they collected some hairs. And outside, a potentially bigger clue, a 6-foot length of duct tape, wadded up and embedded with hair.
About every 8 inches, there was a large number of long human hairs, and then a space, and then long human hairs, as if the tape had been used as a gag, had been wrapped around the mouth of someone.
Investigators hoped this was what they needed to link Grissom to the victims. They compared the hairs on the tape to those gathered from the missing women's hairbrushes. But the sun had bleached the hair found on the roof, making a definitive comparison impossible. That, along with the gag, suggested she had been held there against her will. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why was there no sign of her roommate, Teresa Brown, or of Joan Butler? Where were the women now? While investigators pondered these questions, the case progressed on another front. The results from the testing of the bloodstain found in Joan Butler's trunk had come back from the lab. The DNA in the sample closely matched DNA from her parents. Physical evidence now linked Grissom to 2 of the 3 victims. Their whereabouts and Grissom's remained a mystery. As police searched for Richard Grissom, their hunt led them from Kansas City to Grandview, Missouri, 22 miles away. Grissom's own car was found abandoned in a parking lot. It was taken to the police impound lot, where detectives spent 5 hours processing the incriminating contents. They found false IDs and stolen credit cards, some belonging to Christine Roosh and Teresa Brown. Police also found keys to their apartment, to the home of Joan Butler, and dozens of others. Family members were brought in to identify the items. The evidence connecting the criminal to his victims was now more than circumstantial. But so far, it was moot. Richard Grissom was even now on the lam, and police were no closer to catching him. Christine Roosh's father identified 3 rings belonging to his daughter. But still, no sign of Christine. 3 days into the investigation, hopes of finding the women alive were fading. As police continued to dig, they learned through an informant that on the very day that Roosh and Brown disappeared, Grissom had rented a second storage locker in the Kansas City suburb of Stanley. He stopped using it just 3 days later. The manager told police a young woman had paid for the unit, but she filled out the application under the direction of a man. The manager couldn't positively identify Grissom's picture. She recalled that the woman seemed distressed, like she needed help. She signed her name Roosh. Yet the woman the manager identified in the photo was Teresa Brown. There seemed no reason for Teresa to impersonate Christine, unless she had no choice. Detectives searched the locker, but found no signs of violence or other leads. Then, on their way out, they spotted something familiar: blue paint.
This storage facility had a computerized gate access where you have to drive up, punch in a series of codes, your PIN, if you will, and then it would allow you entry into the storage facility. The poles were set rather close to the touchpad, and it was apparent that several cars had run into these poles in the past.
The paint was similar to the paint found on Christine's car. Police took chips from the poles and the vehicle and sent them to the Johnson County Crime Lab, where forensic examiner Gary Dirks analyzed them.
The question paint chip displayed no differences when compared against known paint that was removed from a blue concrete pole beside the storage shed that Richard Grissom rented.
The blue chip helped police paint a picture of what might have happened in the storage shed.
Our belief of the coming and goings from this storage facility was that that's where he was hiding out. That's where he was hiding from the police, and that's where he most likely was hiding Christine Roosh and very possibly Teresa Brown.
As Kansas City police continued their search for 3 missing women, a final clue turned up on the other side of town, courtesy of an 18-year-old Good Samaritan. He was on his way home from work when he spotted something on the roadside. It seemed someone had lost their valuables: a checkbook, credit cards, receipts, and other papers. The young man decided to contact the owner. Her name was Christine Roosh. Police found 4 checks unaccounted for in the ledger. They were traced and recovered. On the morning of Monday, June 26th, the day Christine called in sick, she cashed them at the drive-up windows of 4 branches of her bank. Within an hour, her account was emptied of $2,400. None of the transactions were filmed, but police believed Grissom was with Christine.
You can look at her checks as she signs them that morning. Clearly, Christine Roosh, very steady, legible handwriting. With each check, the signature degrades more and more and more to the point that the last one, you almost can't read it. And you can only imagine, Christine sitting in the front seat of a car, knowing that what her fate might be.
At 10 p.m. that same day, Christine drove to an ATM in Belton, Missouri, and cleaned out the bank account of her friend, Teresa Brown. Police believed by this point Grissom had already killed Teresa, and Christine was next. These are the last photos taken of Christine alive. Kansas City police were desperate to capture the elusive Richard Grissom. Then they got a break. Grissom slipped up and told friends where he was heading. They informed the police, who apprehended him in Texas and brought him back to Kansas.
You grow up in there?
Leavenworth. Well,
The police still had no bodies, but they had a long chain of evidence leading to Richard Grissom. Besides the stolen jewelry and emptied bank accounts, they amassed a wealth of forensic evidence: bloodstains, paint flakes, and hair samples.
Each forensic piece of evidence by itself probably did not make or break the case, but the consistent thing about all those small pieces of evidence were that they all pointed directly at Richard Grissom as being the perpetrator of these crimes.
On November 4th, 1990, Richard Grissom was convicted of kidnapping, robbery, theft, fraud, and murder. He's serving multiple life sentences in the Kansas State Prison. Grissom never explained what happened back in Kansas City, but police have their own theories. Grissom had keys to the apartment of Christine Roosh and Teresa Brown, so getting in was no problem for him. He'd also done work in Joan Butler's apartment complex and obtained a key for her unit as well. To this day, the whereabouts of the missing women remains a mystery, closely guarded by Richard Grissom.
I think Grissom is a true power freak, and I believe that this is his last act of defiance, that he was able to get over on the police, be able to prove that he is superior in some manner, because the investigators have never been able to find the bodies, and I think that's his last card.
A determined, experienced killer can tax a police department's resources, but so can a killer who acts on impulse. Elizabeth, New Jersey is an industrial town and a residential suburb of New York City. Like any city, it has its share of crime, and its police force is trained to handle whatever might come up, through deadly force or shrewd detective work. Once a criminal is in their sights, they don't give up. Shortly after 6 a.m. on Wednesday, August 5th, 1992, a mechanic arrived for work at his auto shop. He spotted a car parked out front that didn't belong there. He found out the owner was Karen Sherrier. He phoned her to pick up her car, but her parents said she wasn't home. They hadn't heard from her in 2 days. Her family was alarmed to learn that Karen hadn't shown up for work, that her car had been abandoned. Her sister reported her missing. Detective Christopher Kenny was assigned to the case.
The family was definitely concerned right from the beginning. It was unlike her to not call anybody or contact anybody over a period of time. She has a lot of friends located here in Elizabeth. Her family was down ashore, and she would be in touch with someone. At this time, she hadn't called anyone or spoke to anyone.
From the family, police learned that Karen had gone out for a night on the town 2 days before. One of the bars she stopped in was right across the street from where her car was found. On the same day that Karen Sherrier was reported missing, police launched a search to pick up her trail. It led 3 blocks away to the City of Elizabeth Recreation Pier along the Elizabeth River. There, a police dog picked up Karen's scent going onto the pier. And then the trail went cold. The search for Karen Sherrier took New Jersey detectives back to the last place she was seen, the bar across the street from where her car was parked. The owner and one of his customers recalled seeing Karen early on the morning of Tuesday, August 4th. She was with a man named Joseph Zabita. Detectives called Zabita in for questioning after learning that he had been paroled from prison just a few months before. According to Detective Kenny, at this point, he seemed a likely suspect.
The criminal history showed that he had been arrested numerous times in the past, and that he had also been arrested for a rape and had spent time in prison for a rape.
Zabita admitted being with Sherrier the night she vanished. He explained they went bar hopping on Monday the 3rd, and early on the morning of the 4th wound up at a tavern on Front Street. He said Sherrier was giving him a ride home when they passed a man she knew. She stopped, Zabita got out, the other man got in. That, Zabita said, was the last time he saw Karen. He said he didn't know the other man's name or where they were going. During the interview, detectives noticed a crescent-shaped bruise on Zabita's arm. He explained he had caught it in the tailgate of a pickup truck. He allowed the detectives to take photographs for the record.
Once we were done interviewing him and talking to him that evening, we had to let him go because we had no evidence to hold him.
Still, detectives didn't buy Zabita's story. The bruise on his arm looked a lot like a bite mark. To be sure, they sent the photographs to forensic dental consultant Haskell Askin.
I did determine upon looking at the photographs that this was, in my opinion, a human bite mark, and it was a matter of finding the teeth to match up with this bite mark.
If Karen Sherrier made that mark, it would prove that more went on than Zabita admitted. But to match the teeth that made the mark, investigators still had to find Sherrier. The next day, they were back on the waterfront. This time, they brought along an officer from the New Jersey State Police Missing Persons Unit. Again, the search was futile. With no word from Karen Sherrier and no reason for her to disappear on her own, investigators had to assume she was dead. Detective Kenny had no motive, no evidence, no body, and no case. Still, he kept his suspect in his sights. Zabita was the last person seen with Karen Sherrier.
We would call Mr. Zabita in, we would speak to him, talk to him again. He stayed to his story, basically, and We spent about 3 months just trying to find Karen Sherrier's body.
Police had tried everything, from interviewing witnesses to tracking with bloodhounds, and had come up empty. The victim's family applied pressure to keep looking.
Karen Sherrier's family and friends came to us and they requested that we do a search. They wanted to do a search. They felt like they wanted to do something to try to find her. They told us they would go out, they would make up flyers, they would get volunteers.
Investigators agreed to one more search. But then, Mother Nature intervened. The worst storm in a century walloped the New Jersey coast, churning up the entire Elizabeth River waterfront. Once the flooding subsided, Sherrier's family insisted that the search proceed. Some 30 police officers, firefighters, and civilians combed the banks of the Elizabeth River, not far from where Karen's car had been found. But the odds of finding anything now seemed astronomical. They searched all day without turning up anything. Then, near the railroad bridge, a searcher noticed something in the weeds a few feet from the water's edge. He'd found a human skull. It was apparently washed up by the storm, then left behind as the waters receded. It was an amazing find, but was it the remains of Karen Sherrier? The teeth would provide proof positive, except that every last one of them was missing. The search for Karen Sherrier turned up a skull in the Elizabeth River, but without the teeth, the first solid clue seemed utterly useless. Investigators brought Haskell Askin back on the case to apply his expertise. His first finding was unsettling.
Examination of the skull suggested to me that the teeth had been forcibly or traumatically removed from the skull.
Even though the teeth were missing, Askin found distinguishing traits in the skull. The shape of the sockets where the teeth had been, the shape of the roots, and a distinctively shaped bone along the sinuses. Askin then compared his findings to skull x-rays taken by Sherrier's dentist. There was no doubt in Askin's mind. The skull was Karen Sherrier's. Armed with these findings, detectives returned to the Zabita household and served an arrest warrant on Joseph Zabita. Down at the station, he revised his story.
We explained to him what we believe happened. We told him what evidence we did have. After talking with Joe Zabita for a little bit of time, Joe Zabita admitted to us that he did, in fact, kill Karen Sherrier.
As before, Zabita said they left the tavern in the victim's car. By now, they had spent several hours together, and he had slowly won Sherrier's trust. Then, he betrayed it. They drove to an access road down by the Elizabeth River. There, he ordered her to stop the car. They began to fight, and Zabita hit Karen in the face. He couldn't recall how many times.
He struck her. Once he struck her, she wasn't moving. He was nervous, worried.
Zabita left her there. Then he parked her car across from the auto body shop and walked home.
What happened there?
Zabita never explained why he cut off the victim's head. Police speculate that Zabita, worried after being questioned about the crime, returned to the scene and tried to destroy the victim's physical identification. In our legal system, a confession may not guarantee a conviction. Cases are won on the merits of the evidence. Without the victim's teeth, investigators couldn't prove she made the bite mark on Zabita's arm. They had nothing to definitively link the suspect to her. So they asked Zabita to show them where he dumped the body. Police divers never found the remains. Detectives built their case on what they had. Eyewitnesses who saw Zabita with the victim on her last night alive, and the x-rays of the victim's skull. Joseph Zabita pled guilty to aggravated manslaughter and was sentenced to life in prison. He won't be eligible for parole for 25 years. Investigators traced Karen Sherrier's murder to a chance meeting with a sinister stranger. Detectives in South Portland, Maine, had far less to go on. On August 16, 1991, police were called to the home of William and Pearl Bruns. Pearl's daughter, Elaine, was worried because she hadn't heard from her mother in 3 days.
So when was the last time you spoke with your mother?
Pearl never went far from home and always phoned her. Detective Linda Barker spoke with Elaine.
The daughter was very adamant that her mother always called her at least once or twice during the week.
She calls me like 2-3 times a week. I haven't heard from her in a couple of days now.
Inside, the first thing the detective noticed was droplets of dried blood starting in the kitchen sink and trailing through the house.
I saw drops of blood at the sink. I saw drops of blood as you go into the bathroom and in the bathroom sink. Indeed, there was a lot of drops of blood in various places throughout the home.
Elaine explained that her mother was a hemophiliac and bled easily when cut. Pearl had cut herself in the kitchen on the day Elaine last saw her and had rushed to the bathroom to dress the wound.
Can I show you the rest of the house? Sure.
Along the way, she must have left a trail. Aside from the disconcerting bloodstains, most of the Bruns' home was neat and orderly, but the bedroom was a shambles.
Yeah, I don't know where she would have been going, but this is not the way she passed.
It looked as though Pearl was interrupted while packing to leave.
Oh, look, there's some more blood.
On the suitcase were more drops of blood.
Like I said, even a small cut. Well, I mean, it's unusual just that, she...
On the bookcase, Elaine noticed something that upset her more than the blood.
Well, she never took
her
this
mother's
ring off.
friendship
This is
ring.
From her best friend. She got it 14 years ago, and it's never left.
Elaine explained that Pearl never went anywhere without it.
And you just now found that?
Yes.
She also said that Pearl had not taken her car. Pearl loved her Cadillac, and it was still sitting in the garage. And she said there was no way her mother would leave without her beloved Cadillac.
The Cadillac might have been the only beloved thing in the home. After 5 years, the Bruns' marriage had soured. Elaine said when she last saw Pearl, she was depressed. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her husband complained of Pearl's spending. Pearl had told Elaine, "I'd be better off dead." She wondered if Pearl might have done something rash. There was no sign of her anywhere in the house. The one place the Portland police hadn't looked was a place Pearl rarely ventured: the cellar. They didn't find her, but they found more blood. It was red, not brown, so it looked fresh.
You do agree this does look like it's blood?
With Pearl nowhere to be found, the logical person to question was her husband, William. He was a truck driver who was out on the road.
Hi, what's your want?
When he returned, William Bruns recapped his last day with Pearl. After Elaine left, he said, an argument broke out over the same old thing: money. Around 6 that evening, he left the house. He said he went to a donut shop, ran some errands, then stopped for dinner. When he got home, Pearl wasn't there. She didn't return, and he never gave it another thought.
It became very apparent that she didn't just leave, and he just didn't care.
Barker launched an exhaustive investigation into the whereabouts of Pearl Bruns. She questioned neighbors. She visited Pearl's old haunts. No one had seen Pearl since she'd been reported missing. Next, Barker phoned taxi services, bus depots, and airlines. Every call was a dead end. If Pearl had left town, it seemed she'd gone on her own 2 feet, or hadn't really left at all. With no sign of Pearl, the detective returned to speak with William Bruns. A casual remark turned into a potential clue.
I said, gee, Bill, you've had your carpet cleaned. And he goes, oh, no, I haven't cleaned it at all. And I said, well, then you've replaced it. I mean, this is like brand new rug. I mean, that's how clean it was. And he said, no, I haven't cleaned it and I haven't replaced it.
But a check with neighbors revealed that he had rented a commercial carpet cleaner a few days earlier. Why he would cover up such a trivial matter made investigators only more suspicious. By now, 2 months had passed since Pearl Bruns had dropped out of sight. No one had seen her or heard from her. The police suspected she wasn't simply missing, but murdered. They'd handle the case as a homicide. They used cadaver dogs to continue their search. They combed rivers and woods and other places where a body would likely be concealed. None turned up. Their main suspect was William Bruns, who still seemed unconcerned about his wife's disappearance. Bruns drove his refrigerated delivery truck throughout New England and into Canada. If he were the killer, he could have disposed of his wife anywhere. A check of the truck revealed it had been scrubbed clean. No traces of blood were found. In Maine, homicide investigations are conducted by the state police. Sergeant Mike Harriman was assigned to the case. Harriman began with the Brunses' home, if only to rule it out.
We wanted to better search the home and the surrounding areas to see if possibly Pearl's remains were within the home, in the basement, or in the surrounding area, possibly buried in a shallow grave.
On November 17th, investigators paid another visit to William Bruns. This time, they brought a cadaver dog to search the woods around the house. The search was another dead end. In the cellar, the dog detected something. Yet when police dug, they found nothing.
It likely will be.
While the search was proceeding, Harriman interviewed William Bruns. Suddenly, the normally stoic Bruns seemed shaken.
He broke down and started crying, and we thought, well, maybe we're going to begin to hear something here. And then he just reiterated, I wouldn't hurt my Pearlie.
Now that the case had moved from missing persons to homicide, the detectives analyzed the dark brown stains found all over the Bruns home. Maybe not all of it was Pearl's. Perhaps it wasn't even blood. They didn't want to overlook any detail. At the State Crime Lab, forensics expert Ron Kaufman ran 2 tests. The first simple test would determine if the stains were actually blood. It proved positive. The second test would determine if the blood was human. He used an enzyme that reacts to human blood proteins. It reacted, proving the blood was human. But the lab couldn't determine if the blood was Pearl's.
We had no record of Mrs. Brunn's blood type. So eventually, we sent samples of the blood that we found on the suitcase, along with a blood sample from her daughter and the biological father of that daughter, to a private DNA laboratory, where they conducted what they call reverse paternity testing on the samples.
The reverse paternity test yielded a match. The blood came from Pearl Brunn's. The blood evidence gave the state police enough evidence for a warrant. They returned to Brunn's home and began looking for more blood, enough to indicate foul play. This time, they sprayed the entire house with luminol, a chemical that makes even the faintest residue of blood glow in the dark. Detectives were astounded by the results.
And the whole area lit up bright green, the whole carpet, the wall. It was quite incredible. You could actually even see footsteps where someone had walked through the blood, and you could also see where someone had cleaned the carpet. You could see the motions back and forth where someone had attempted to clean it, and indeed had cleaned it by the naked eye, but the luminol could pick up the blood.
Detectives submitted the stains to the forensics lab. As they feared, it was Pearl's blood in fatal amounts. Detectives concluded that William Bruns had lied about more than cleaning his carpet. But to prove murder, they needed the body. Police believed that Pearl Bruns was murdered in her home, but they weren't at all certain they'd find the body there. Cadaver dogs couldn't pinpoint anything. Sergeant Mike Harriman knew they needed more drastic measures.
We had either the choice of removing the house from the foundation and digging that cellar with a backhoe, or finding an alternative means, which was ground-penetrating radar, to thoroughly scan that basement to see if there was a disturbance in that soil.
Ground-penetrating radar beams high-frequency radio waves into the earth. The reflected waves can detect anything from fuel tanks to power lines by revealing changes in the soil structure. Detectives turned to geophysicist Scott Culkin to conduct the search.
If you think of soil layers being laid down horizontally, they have a certain structure. And if that structure is compromised by a shovel, a backhoe, somebody digging, the soil structure, again, is destroyed.
If anyone had dug in the Bruns' cellar, GPR would reveal it. On the morning of September 11th, detectives returned with another warrant. The GPR made pass after pass across the dirt floor.
We have one depression.
About 90 minutes into the survey, the GPR detected an anomaly, a spot where the soil was disturbed.
We informed the Maine State Police of the presence of an anomalous area, and that anomalous area was approximately 5 feet by 18 inches wide, suggesting the presence of some sort of burial pit.
Something was down there. The digging began. After 5 minutes, police uncovered an oblong object wrapped in plastic and bound with a rope. It was a human body. The body was taken to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. On one arm, they found a wristwatch with a name engraved, Pearl Bruns. The examination showed the victim had been struck hard across the face. It was more than her frail body could bear.
She had a broken orbit of her eye, she had a broken cheekbone, broken nasal cannula. Pearl bled to death. If she had been given first aid or a rescue had been called to that home that day, she would have survived the injuries.
Confronted with the evidence, William Bruns pled guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years. Bruns never explained why he let his wife bleed to death without calling for help. Police know the couple was arguing, perhaps over Pearl's spending. The half-packed suitcase implied she was threatening to walk out. What is certain is the case assembled against William Bruns.
The forensics in this case was extremely important. I had done a considerable amount of legwork over the past year, and yet didn't have the tools that the state police actually had. The cadaver sniffing dog, the luminol, the access to the ground penetrating radar. All these tools made the discovery of Pearl's body possible. Without that, we could literally still be looking for her.
Time was, police had to produce a body to prove a murder. No more. Now, murder can be proven when the victim is merely presumed dead. Police find a frozen body in the Arizona desert. The chilling discovery sends investigators searching for more victims. A small town, a brutal murder, and a killer who could be anywhere. When all leads are exhausted, the investigation focuses on a blurry surveillance photo. When a young mother disappears, detectives are left with few clues. But slowly, the evidence begins to point to a dangerous and twisted predator. A lack of clues may cool down a hot investigation. But there's no statute of limitations on murder. Months or even years may pass before forensics can spark a fire under these cold cases. On June 3, 1991, investigators from the Costa Mesa, California Police Department pulled up to an abandoned car on the Corona del Mar freeway. They were responding to a call regarding a missing person, Denise Huber, age 23. No one had seen or heard from her for almost 24 hours, and that wasn't like her. Denise's best friend had found her car on the side of the road while searching for her. Investigators examined it closely, but aside from a flat tire, nothing seemed amiss. The only personal article they found was a pair of pantyhose on the front seat. Denise preferred to drive without them. Though nothing in the car tipped investigators about what had happened, Detective Ron Smith concluded that Denise ran into trouble soon after she had pulled off the road.
What struck us as unusual about the scene and concerned us right from the very beginning was that very near to her car there were emergency call boxes, there were pay phones, there were all-night convenience stores, none of which Denise went to call her parents or to ask for help. We knew right away that something was amiss, something was wrong.
The last person who saw Denise was her date from the night before. She had dropped him off after a concert. Denise never made it home. Bright, popular, just graduated from college, she wasn't the type to worry her parents by going off without a call or note. Her family and friends started to look for her the next morning. After recovering her car, the Costa Mesa police launched a massive search for Denise Huber. They notified law enforcement agencies across the country. They followed up every clue, every lead. Denise's friends and family put up posters and appeared on news programs begging for information. As the months and years passed, the tips dried up. But police kept Denise's case open and as active as they could.
Every day we would do something with the Denise Huber case. We would review old leads. We'd go over old reports again. We'd look one more time at the photographs. We never gave up, even though we never really had anything good to work with.
After 3 years, no one could tell her grieving family and friends what had happened to her. Denise Huber had simply vanished. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away in Arizona's Prescott Valley, authorities were grappling with a mystery of their own. On July 9, 1994, a woman went to buy paint at the home of a man she met at a swap meet. While she waited for him, she noticed a padlocked rental truck and the paint and chemical cans cluttering his yard. She thought they looked out of place for such a respectable neighborhood and wondered if any laws were being broken. Suspicious, she called a friend who worked for the police. Her friend thought it sounded like a clandestine drug lab, which police find in the most unlikely spots. He sent investigators from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department to check it out. The rental truck with the California tags looked like it hadn't been moved in months. The electrical cord snaking out of it and the paint cans all around reinforced the notion that this might be a mobile drug lab. A check of the tag showed the truck had been stolen. Armed with a warrant, police cautiously opened the cargo door. Inside was a freezer.
Ready, guys? We're opening up.
Not knowing what it might contain, they suited up in protective gear. Plastic bags obscured the contents, but at the bottom of the freezer lay a pool of frozen blood. Carefully moving the bags aside, the officers expected to find nothing more than a deer. Instead, Lieutenant Scott Masher uncovered a horrific mystery.
Initially, when we opened the black bags and could tell that we had a human, a frozen body with handcuffs behind the back, ice crystals. It was grim.
The homeowner still hadn't returned, so police ran the license plates on the white pickup, also parked in the driveway. The owner was identified as John Joseph Famolaro. Within an hour, Famolaro and his mother pulled up to the house. Sheriff's deputies took Famolaro into custody, charging him with stealing the rental truck. They were anxious to find out more about the body in the freezer. Mrs. Famolaro, who lived next door, told detectives that her son was a house painter, which explained the paint cans. She said the truck had been parked there about 2 months. She didn't know anything about the freezer or its contents, except that the electricity in John's house had been turned off for 1 day, and he had asked to run a power cord from her house to the truck. At the police station, Famolaro was polite but uncooperative. He refused to answer any questions and asked to see his lawyer. Without any assistance from their suspect, investigators would have to rely on physical evidence at the scene to identify the body in the freezer and to find out how it got there. They charged Famolaro with homicide.
We need to have a videotape
The next
of the room
day,
as it
warrant
is.
in hand, investigators entered Familaro's house, hoping to find information about the victim in the freezer. In its frozen condition, they couldn't even discern the victim's gender.
Look through these things on the chair.
Familaro's house was crammed with his belongings. This was the home of a man who never threw anything away. If clues were here, they'd be difficult to find. After more than 2 weeks of searching, investigators found several promising clues. The first was a set of handcuff keys that matched the cuffs on the victim.
Bag it and tag it. Okay.
The next clue took investigators by surprise. 2 complete Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department uniforms. In the garage, the deputies found 2 boxes marked Christmas, but there was nothing merry about them. Inside, officers found blood-stained women's clothing and a bloody hammer and nail puller. They also found a pair of women's shoes, the backs badly scuffed, as though the woman who wore them was dragged.
Get a couple of bags here. A shot of this hammer.
And that wasn't all.
We did locate numerous female identifications. That included Social Security cards, I believe some driver's license, and other identification, obviously raising the concern of maybe we had additional victims.
Yavapai County Police had to face the very real possibility that John Familaro was a serial killer. Arizona investigators looking into a murder had every reason to believe that there may be more than one victim. To test that theory, investigators brought in cadaver dogs to locate more bodies on John Familaro's property. The dogs, trained to detect the slightest whiff of decay, alerted their handlers several times. Officers dug up every spot and still found nothing. But they never completely gave up the suspicion that the killer had struck before.
I just got that paperwork from Costa Mesa.
Police followed up on every piece of ID found in the Christmas boxes. Much to their relief, they found that each woman was alive and accounted for, except one from Costa Mesa, California. Her name was Denise Huber. To confirm her ID, Yavapai County forensic technician Mike Winnie lifted a thumbprint from the thawing victim and compared it with the one printed on Denise Huber's California driver's license. The prints matched, identifying Huber as the victim. To authorities in Arizona, the name meant nothing. But to Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, it was the news he had waited 3 anxious years to hear.
The call I received from Lieutenant Scott Masher from Yavapai County was that he thought maybe he had a body identified as Denise Huber and asked us if we were familiar with Denise Huber. Well, of course, I almost fell out of my chair when he mentioned the name.
Now that she had been found, investigators in Arizona had to determine how she had been killed. Working with the frozen and decomposed remains presented a unique set of challenges to Maricopa County Medical Examiner Ann Buchholz.
In our environment, to examine a frozen body is very unusual. We deal 99% of the time with people who have been exposed to heat elements, and that is more our area of expertise than someone who has been in a cold environment. It took the body approximately 2 days to thaw, where we could actually perform the internal examination.
On Friday, July 16, 1994, Yavapai detective Scott Masher and Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, along with other officers, gathered in the medical examiner's lab to observe the autopsy. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in multiple fractures. To identify the murder weapon, investigators needed to evaluate the entire skull to see where and how the blows had been struck. They called in forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginitti.
How many days are we looking at here?
Reconstructing a person's skull is very similar to doing a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, you have about 50 pieces and you need to put them back into what you know to be the right composition.
It took Fulginitti 2 days to reconstruct the skull, never losing sight of the fact that this victim was once a person.
And I remember standing in this very room thinking to myself, how did you come to be in my sphere? This is not right. It's not natural for you to be here.
She determined that the victim had sustained more than 35 blows to the head. The wounds were consistent with the hammer and nail puller pulled from the box in Familaro's garage. To be certain, the lab ran tests. Technicians were able to establish a DNA profile from the blood residue on the nail puller. It matched the DNA profile taken of the victim's own blood. The match confirmed that they had found the murder weapon. To build their case, investigators had to retrace the events that led from the victim's abandoned car on a California freeway to John Familaro's freezer in Arizona.
Covered initially as far as the search warrants at this point.
It was very important for both agencies, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and the Costa Mesa Police Department, to work together and piece the evidence from California and Arizona to one case, one solid case, in order to successfully prosecute this.
The Costa Mesa Police Department gathered information on Familaro's activities during the time he lived in California. They learned that he had attended the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Reserve Academy, but he couldn't make the grade and dropped out after just a few weeks. He kept his uniforms, which police found at his house. Further investigation led detectives to a warehouse in Laguna Hills, 12 miles from where Denise Huber's empty car was found. John Familaro had stored some paint and supplies in the warehouse, then moved everything out when he left the area in August 1992, 13 months after Denise Huber vanished. Investigators thought it was likely that Familaro had committed the murder here. They hoped to recover forensic evidence that would tie the killer to the crime and determine where the killer's trial would take place. Police searched the unit for evidence of the crime, using luminol to expose traces of blood. Applied to a surface and viewed under an alternate light source, luminol reveals blood stains invisible to the naked eye, even traces left years earlier.
We found that the warehouse was huge, but I wanted every square inch luminol for blood. Almost the very last bottle in the very last corner that we looked, we sprayed luminol into the corner against the wall. And all of a sudden, the luminol just lit up. This bright glow showed us we found what we were looking for.
Technicians compared this blood to a sample taken from the victim in Arizona. They matched. The forensic analysis gave Detective Smith of the Costa Mesa Police the proof he needed to make the case.
The forensic science in testing the blood was absolutely critical. Number one, it established that the crime occurred in California, and that established jurisdiction. It also positively identified that blood as Denise. It put Denise at that scene.
Familaro never confessed. The forensic evidence spoke for him. The investigators had successfully matched the blood in the California storage unit to the victim in Arizona. And that placed the victim within deadly proximity of John Familaro. Authorities believe that Huber pulled off the road with a flat tire. Spotting his prey, John Famolaro approached under the guise of lending a helping hand. He abducted Denise Huber in Costa Mesa, California, in the early morning of June 3, 1991. Famolaro murdered her sometime later, hid her body in a freezer, trucked it to Arizona, and kept it until police discovered his crime 3 years later. John Famolaro was sentenced to death. He awaits execution on California's death row. Famolaro hid his crime by keeping the body close to him. Other killers are not so conniving, but they can be equally elusive. It was a December evening in 1990. Peggy Phillips wondered why her husband Dean was taking so long to lock up the Launderette they owned in Ozona, Texas. It was just next door, but he'd been gone 20 minutes. She found him lying on the floor, bleeding and barely conscious. Police and paramedics raced to save him. Peggy thought that Dean must have fallen and hit his head. But the paramedics could see that this was no accident. Dean Phillips had been beaten nearly to death. Peggy watched as the paramedics loaded her husband into the ambulance. It was the last time she saw him alive. Dean Phillips died early the next morning, December 26th. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators determined that Phillips had interrupted a burglary and paid dearly for it. They found only one hard clue, a single fingerprint lifted from a coin box left on the floor. They sent the print to the Texas Department of Public Safety. Like small-town police departments all over Texas, the Ozona police depended on the DPS crime lab for forensic services. This time, though, the Department of Public Safety came up empty. The coin box fingerprint didn't match anything they had on file. News of Dean Phillips's death spread through Ozona. Crockett County Chief Deputy Sheriff Alton Davis was determined to catch the criminal who had shattered the quiet of this little town.
We've got a population of probably 3,000 to 4,000 people, so it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, and it was a real shock to the community that something like this could happen in Ozona.
The community stepped forward to help the investigation. A witness reported seeing two local men wearing bloody clothes the night Phillips was killed. A warrant was obtained, and their bloody clothes were confiscated before they had time to launder them. Brought in for questioning, the men claimed they were hunters and that the blood was from a deer they had poached.
Last night we had a very serious
Investigators were skeptical until they got confirmation from the DPS crime lab.
Let's get to the question. What time did you
The
get
blood
call?
was indeed from a deer,
10:30.
and the men's fingerprints didn't match the one lifted from the coin box at Phillips's laundry. The case's first promising tip amounted to nothing. A clerk at a convenience store right off the interstate gave investigators their next lead.
Got a couple minutes I can talk to you?
A man came in an hour before the murder and asked where the Launderette was.
And we're just checking the neighborhood.
She described him as stocky, with dirty blonde hair and a t-shirt with radio call letters.
Oh, yeah? Oh, what time was that?
He drove a beat-up blue van with a green door on the passenger side. There may have been a passenger in the van. Investigators hope to see the suspect on the store's surveillance tape.
Okay, good. Okay. Okay. So you have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
But the security camera was old. The man's face was a blur. Neither the DPS nor the FBI could enhance the image electronically. The investigators were convinced they had their suspect on this tape, but his image, like their chances of finding him, were dim.
How you doing today?
As the investigation into the murder of Dean Phillips continued, witnesses reported seeing a strange blue van in town the night of the murder. Some thought they saw two people in it. Sheriff Alton Davis believed that Phillips's killer was a stranger just passing through town.
Ozona is right on Interstate 10, or more or less out in the middle of nowhere. This is the first one we've had where someone has came off the interstate and murdered one of our local people.
Investigators knew the killer was probably hundreds of miles away by now. And then they got the call. A van, matching the one described by the witnesses, was stopped about 200 miles west of town. Davis sped to the scene.
We found an old GMC van, light blue, that had a dark passenger door on it, dark primer colored. And we took photographs of the van. We talked to there was a Hispanic male driving it, which didn't fit the description of our suspect.
The case had run into another dead end. Reviewing the clues they'd gathered so far, investigators realized that all they had to go on was a blurry surveillance tape and a store clerk's fading recollection. They needed some way to turn these hazy clues into solid information. Then they recalled Karen Taylor, an experienced forensic artist with the Special Crimes Service of the Texas DPS. Taylor had worked with the Ozona police on missing persons cases. She is a pioneer in the forensic art and science of facial reconstruction, developing witnesses' vague descriptions into recognizable faces of criminal suspects.
My function is to take some bit of information from a crime that occurs, produce some sort of a visual image that can be put out in the media, and hopefully it will trigger additional information that can be used to connect the crime to the victim or connect the crime to the suspect.
Ozona police sent Taylor stills taken from the videotape. But after she had evaluated the black and white photos, she wasn't sure she'd be able to help.
So I had a look at those stills to see just what I could determine about the face. It was very blurry, the quality was pretty poor, so I could see that there wasn't much likelihood we could enhance that video electronically, and it would probably boil down to my trying to just do some sort of a sketch based on what I could see.
Taylor knew that while every feature might not be rendered perfectly, the sketch's resemblance to the suspect would be strong enough to help the investigation.
Well, after years of doing this, I've come to believe that the most important thing to capture in a face for a forensic artist to trigger recognition is getting the proportions right. Each of the component parts in a face, each of the features, the eyes, nose, mouth, is important, but it's not as important as the arrangement of those features on a face.
Taylor wasn't sure the image had enough information for her to work from. Then she noticed a feature she'd overlooked: the store clerk. She had talked with the suspect face to face. Taylor hoped the clerk might provide the missing details she needed to sharpen the picture.
Using the video stills, I prepared as much of a drawing as I could, maybe 85% done, and then faxed it to the witness got on the phone with her, and she was able to make some changes. She said she wanted me to make the eyes look light, make the lower face look more slim, and I did that. We hung up. I spent about 15 minutes making those alterations, and then I refaxed it to her, and she checked it and said, yes, that's right. So I was able to get the benefit of her long-distance input over the phone and using the fax.
Here he was, the most likely suspect in the murder of Dean Phillips. The Crockett County Sheriff's Office prepared a crime bulletin. Karen Taylor's drawing of the suspect's face was circulated across the country and to every radio station where someone might recognize the call letters on the suspect's shirt. Taylor's drawing represented the investigation's last hope. But when all the publicity brought no response, the Dean Phillips murder case came to a dead halt. The beating death of Dean Phillips looked like it was destined to go unsolved. Sheriff Alton Davis and his team had exhausted their last leads.
Eventually, we'd ruled everybody out we were getting, and the leads stopped coming in, and we didn't have anything to work on, and it just more or less went cold, and we just had to sit until we got some other type of leads.
5 years came and went without another clue or lead. But Peggy Phillips was determined to bring her husband's murderer to justice. She contacted a television crime show and asked if they'd run her story. In August 1996, just over 5.5 years after Phillips was killed, the TV show aired the story of his murder and featured Karen Taylor's drawing. That's what got the phones ringing. From around the country, viewers called in leads. Texas Ranger Jerry Byrne fielded the calls and directed the investigation. One tip led him to Paul Wesley Taylor, a convict at Utah's minimum security prison in Draper. Ranger Byrne contacted Draper Prison and asked for Taylor's records and a photograph. When he saw it, Byrne felt that at last they had tracked down their suspect.
The photograph of Paul Wesley Taylor was nearly identical to a composite drawing that a DPS artist had conducted back in 1991. Initially, I felt like it was too good to be true.
Byrne sent Taylor's records and fingerprint card to the DPS. They matched Taylor's right ring finger with the coin box fingerprint. After years without progress, this was a giant step forward. Investigators went back to the original set of clues, looking for more connections to the suspect. They found out that Taylor's brother worked at a radio station with the call letters seen on Taylor's shirt. They were now certain Paul Wesley Taylor was involved with the murder of Dean Phillips. But they wanted to know about the van's passenger, a witness or possibly an accomplice to Phillips's murder. Taylor's arrest record showed that his girlfriend had been with him at the time of his arrest in Georgia. Georgia authorities located the woman. Her answers filled the remaining gaps in the case against Taylor. She told Ranger Byrne that they had traveled through Texas during December 1990 and that Taylor had pulled up outside of a Launderette and gone in. She saw him fighting, and he returned to the van with blood on his shirt. And she certainly didn't know that anyone had been killed.
He never said that he killed him?
She led investigators to a field where Taylor had ditched his bloody clothes, along with a stolen coin box. They now had a credible witness who placed Taylor in the Launderette at the time of the murder. Utah extradited Paul Wesley Taylor back to Texas. On September 15, 1998, nearly 8 years after the killing, he pled guilty to the capital murder of Dean Phillips. On the 21st, he was sentenced to life in prison. Forensic artist Karen Taylor had turned a single blurry photograph into an image that helped unmask and apprehend a bald-faced killer.
When that photograph and drawing were presented, they knew that it was Paul Wesley Taylor. That photograph and that composite drawing is what broke this case open.
Investigators speculate that Paul Wesley Taylor got off the interstate in Ozona to get some food and gas. Short of money, Taylor got the idea to knock over the Launderette after closing time. Dean Phillips was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In other cases, tragedy stalks its victims. August 16, 1989, Joe Gilbreth finished work and arrived at his home in Villanau, Georgia. He was looking forward to spending the evening with his baby girl, Amber, and his wife, Nikia. He noticed that his wife's car was gone. This was odd. Nikia was usually home fixing supper at this hour. When he went inside, he started to worry. Nikia would never let Amber sit in her pajamas all day, and there was no way she'd ever leave the baby in the house by herself. The doors were unlocked and didn't look like they had been tampered with. When Nikia's family told Joe they hadn't heard from her, he called the police.
Nikia.
The Walker County Sheriff's Department sent officers to investigate.
Check the residence and you don't see her, and you're on the
Joe and his mother-in-law reported 3 missing items: a blue telephone cord that had been ripped from the wall, a bedspread that had a sheet stitched to one side, and all of Nikia's underwear. Based on what he found in the house, Detective Pat Bedford believed that Nikia Gilbreth's disappearance was more sinister than the simple missing persons case he was originally sent to investigate.
My first impressions are, she was taken out of here bound. Somebody forcibly was taking her from this residence. When you tie that into the fact that it was realized that a whole drawer full of her undergarments and lingerie was missing, it makes you think that we're dealing with a serious crime here.
Checked around, see if there's anything missing by chance. Took a shower.
Joe Gilbreth told the police that the day had started like any other.
I checked all the house.
The alarm went off at 5:30. Joe got up and got ready for work. Nikia went back to bed. And by 6 a.m., the house was quiet. Joe and the baby were the last to have seen Nikia. A squad car was stationed at the house in case she might return, but Nikia never came home. On August 18, 1989, the day after she had disappeared, the Walker County Sheriff's Department had little to go on.
We got a tragedy here. We got a problem. At first, no good leads to follow up on. Her car had not been located. She had not been located. Didn't appear to have any leads from talking to neighbors and searching the immediate area. We had nothing at that point.
But that soon changed when Nikia's mother found her daughter's car abandoned on a logging road a half-mile north of the Gilbreth house. Investigators hoped they'd find clues to help locate her. Technicians raised fingerprints all over the car, but they belonged to members of the Gilbreth family. officers found indications of a second car parked next to Nikia's. It was an ominous sign, but the tire impression wasn't distinct enough to photograph or print. Nikia's mother noted that the baby quilt Nikia always kept in the back seat was missing. And that was it. Nothing at the scene offered a clue of what had happened to Nikia or where she might be now. Still, her family held out hope that she'd come back to them unharmed. Though investigators believed she was a victim of foul play, they had no evidence and no suspects. Joe had passed a polygraph indicating that he wasn't involved. All they had were a few missing items and an abandoned car, but still no sign of Nikia. Two days later, a boy collecting empty cans along the highway made a crucial, gruesome discovery. The body was too decomposed for a positive visual ID, though it was a white female about Nikia's size with the clothes and jewelry Joe had described. Dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. The autopsy determined that Nikia had died from asphyxiation. The examination also revealed marks around her wrists and ankles, marks that could have been made with telephone cord. But there was no other significant forensic evidence. No hairs or fibers, no fingerprints on the body. Nothing that might dictate the investigation's next step. Investigators considered a number of suspects, but none of them panned out. Leads dried up. The case went cold.
Unfortunately, we were going nowhere in the case. We had no good leads, no good suspects. Any tips that we got, we did everything from roadblocks, car to car, house to house, door to door searches, searched the area thoroughly. We weren't able to really locate anything that was helping us. Several months went by and we really weren't making any progress in solving this case. You cannot let something like this go on. You've got to be able to solve this case.
Then, 4 months after Nikia Gilbreth disappeared, investigators heard about a similar case in nearby Gordon County. A young woman was abducted by an intruder while her child slept. For 14 hours, he forced her to model lingerie for him and assaulted her repeatedly. Then, he brought her back home. Before police could identify the woman's assailant, the case took a bizarre turn. The investigation into the death of Nikia Gilbreth had led to a similar account of a woman's abduction. The connection was weak, but it was their only lead. 2 days after the assault, the woman's father reported to police that he saw a strange man drop off a Christmas tree at her house. When investigators ran the truck's license plate, they discovered that it was registered to James Ray Ward. He worked for a nearby well drilling company. The woman picked out Ward's picture from a photo lineup. She recalled that during the day she was being held, she told her assailant that she hadn't had a chance to get her child a Christmas tree. Officers took Ward into custody a short time later. Ward pled guilty to rape and was just starting a 20-year prison term. In their check into his whereabouts prior to his arrest, police learned that Ward had drilled a well at the Gilbreths a year earlier. Then he returned to check on it in July 1989, just a month before Nikia was killed. Ward's employer said that drillers were never sent back to check on wells. Ward had acted on his own. The similarities between the abduction of his rape victim and the abduction of Nikia Gilbreth provided police with their only lead. When officers searched the home Ward shared with his wife and children, they found a stash of women's undergarments that didn't belong to Ward's wife. Detectives also uncovered a receipt for well drilling made out to the Gilbreths. But it was much more than a receipt.
Had directions, the road name, the mileage that would have led me right to the Gilbreth residence. The description of the victim he had written in there matched her description, including an age of a daughter that the victim had. Then we had our first direct link from the murder to a suspect.
Investigators also found items missing from the Gilbreths' home. A bathing suit bottom, a baby quilt, a bedspread, and a blue telephone cord.
Got it. Phone cord.
In order to build the strongest case against Ward, investigators needed to prove premeditation. They obtained a statement Ward had written regarding the abduction he'd pled guilty to. They wanted to compare this writing sample with the incriminating notes jotted on the Gilbreths' receipt found in his home. Document examiner Karen Scott performed the analysis.
A handwriting comparison is basically a side-by-side comparison. I look for features in the writing of one set and I see if I find the same thing in the other set. And I'm looking for things like how the letters are on the piece of paper, how they're formed, how they're spaced.
Scott looks for the idiosyncrasies, the little details that give a person's handwriting its individual character.
For instance, the F in the word fine, it's very short, the very bottom of it. The D in the word road and side are written opposite the way people are taught. Staff first and then the round part. While this is not in and of itself a unique just to this writer, it is not the way it was taught to be done.
After comparing the note with Ward's known handwriting, Scott was confident that both documents were written by the same person. Investigators then examined the bedspread, quilt, and bathing suit bottom found in Ward's house. Nikia's mother supplied the matching top, which she found in the Gilbreths' home. Because hundreds of identical bathing suits were manufactured and sold, the prosecution had to prove that the bottom found at Ward's and the top found at the Gilbreths were parts of the same suit. To make that assessment, the lab had to compare the amount of fiber wear on both parts of the suit. They concluded that the bottom matched the top. The suit belonged to Nikia Gilbreth. The investigation turned to the other two items, the bedspread and the baby quilt. Before she even put them under a microscope, trace evidence technician Terry Santamaria recognized their significance.
I knew that these types of bedspreads did not come commercially from the manufacturer with a sheet sewn to it, so I knew that the item had been altered by somebody. After determining that, I then examined the baby quilt. When I pulled the baby quilt out, I immediately recognized that this was homemade.
Santamaria called Detective Bedford. These two items, the bedspread and the blanket, were absolutely unique, one-of-a-kind items. They were a direct link from the suspect's home back to the victim. This evidence completed the case against James Ray Ward. At Ward's trial, Nikia's mother-in-law testified that she had stitched the sheet onto the bedspread to cover the rough cloth and had sewn the baby quilt for her granddaughter. The only way that they could have come into Ward's possession was if he had gone into the Gilbreth home and Nikia's car and taken them. Ward never confessed, but based on the evidence, investigators pieced together a scenario for the murder. On the morning of August 17th, Ward watched Joe Gilbreth leave for work. When he saw it was safe, he entered the Gilbreth home and abducted Nakia.
I believe he pulled the telephone wires and the cord away from the wall. I believe he bound her, wrapped her in the quilt, and on the way out the door also took a drawer full of her underwear and lingerie as a trophy.
Prosecutors called Ward a meticulous, organized stalker with a perverted mind. Investigators speculated that he fantasized that the women he was assaulting liked him. That might explain why he returned to place a Christmas tree at the door of one of his victims' homes. Jurors convicted him of murder, and in July 1991, after deliberating just 3 hours, he was sentenced to death for murdering Nakia Gilbreth. When the leads disappear and an investigation stalls, that doesn't mean a case is closed. In a homicide, investigators have an arsenal of forensic techniques and all the time in the world to catch the killer. A blazing house fire illuminates cold-blooded homicide and has possibly destroyed all evidence leading to the killer. It looked like a suicide. Now investigators aren't so sure. The clues are unusual, but do they add up to murder? A killer tries to steer investigators down the wrong road. Can forensics get them back on course? To solve a case, authorities have to know who to trust. That can be a challenge when key players bear false witness. At 6:37 a.m. on August 2nd, 1992, the Evansville, Indiana fire station sprang into action at the report of a burning house. A woman was trapped inside. Intense heat foiled their rescue attempts. The billowing smoke became impenetrable. It was thickest in the bedroom, where the victim was reported to be. The fierce blaze was quickly extinguished, but too late. They couldn't save her. Any loss of life is tragic, but this one struck a personal note with some of the officers on the scene. The call had been made by Evansville police officer Patrick Bradford, who had stopped by the house after his shift and noticed the smoke. The house belonged to 24-year-old Tammy Lohr. Now she was dead. Lohr worked as a civilian jailer for the county. She dreamed of a life in law enforcement and hoped to one day become a police officer.
All right, what we got was where the body was on the bed.
Once the fire was extinguished and the victim removed, investigators walked through the house to see what might have caused it.
They're examining that. They got.
To Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, the evidence led to one conclusion.
We were able to determine that the fire was suspicious in nature very early on, after we made an initial walkthrough of the building and had determined there were some burn patterns in the carpet that were suspicious and very much similar to those produced when a liquid accelerant is poured on the floor.
And what they did is as he came out,
The fire burned a trail on the carpet leading from the bed to the bedroom door. A gasoline can still stood at the epicenter of the blaze. Carpet samples were collected to confirm the presence of the accelerant. Investigators found other signs of foul play. An electrical engineer determined that circuit breakers to the bedroom had been switched off at the box, not tripped by an electrical problem caused by the fire. The phone lines had been cut and shorted together. Anyone calling would have heard a busy signal. And the scuttle hole cover, the hatch leading to the attic, was lying on the floor just outside the bedroom. Soot deposits revealed it had been removed prior to the blaze. Evansville Police Department crime scene investigator Michael Ford witnessed the result.
It was obvious the fire that came out of the room vented through the scuttle cover just right outside the bedroom door, which would have helped vent the fire and let the fire burn a little bit more. It would have taken the fire into the attic and created a more extensive burn on the house.
A smoke detector collected from the scene was missing its battery.
Did y'all guys check the window?
Yeah, well, you guys didn't cut this out.
As the investigators finished with the bedroom area, they looked at the rest of the house. In the kitchen, they found the window propped open with one of the victim's rings. And the screen had been cut. They presumed this was the murderer's entry point. But they weren't entirely certain. For one thing, it was small and not easily accessible.
This is the exact size and everything of the kitchen window. And one of the unique things about it was right below this window at a level about right here, there was a kitchen sink. And on the back of the kitchen sink were several items that had someone come in through this window would have been knocked over. There were some pots and pans that would have made a substantial amount of noise by someone coming through the window.
Investigators also noted that if this were a break-in, the motive wasn't clear. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Attention focused on the window, the alleged point of entry. Something wasn't right about it. In fact, working with a model of the window, investigators determined that whoever cut the screen wasn't breaking in, but breaking out. Based on the angle of the slash through the screen, Ford believed that it most likely had been cut from the inside.
And indicating that a right-handed person would have had to almost cut this screen from the inside, leaning over the counter, because the screen goes from a lower area on the right-hand side to a higher area on the left-hand side, indicating that a right-handed person would have been more than likely to make that pattern from the inside as opposed to the outside.
While investigators pondered the clues, Officer Bradford drove himself to the police station to answer questions about what he saw before he reported the fire. Because Bradford had entered the burning house and was the last person near the body, as part of standard procedure, he handed over his uniform so it could be tested. Investigators hoped it would yield evidence that might have otherwise been destroyed by the flames in the house. Patrick Bradford told investigators that the victim was his mistress. He'd last seen her around 10 the previous night on his way to work. When he finished his shift around 6:30 a.m., he stopped by. As he pulled down the street, he saw smoke billowing out of her house. He said he rushed into the burning building, dropped to his knees, and crawled to the bedroom door, where he saw the bed engulfed in flames. He couldn't find Tammy. That's when he radioed for help. Because the break-in looked staged, investigators suspected that Lore might have known her killer and opened the door to him or her. Bradford suggested that Evansville Police Detective Guy Minnis talk to one of Lore's former co-workers.
Patrick told us that Tammy had some problems with another jailer that used to work in the jail with her. And the day that the body was discovered, that was one of the first people that we interviewed.
Come in and ask a few questions.
Lore had once reported her colleague for making sexual comments and using excessive force on the prisoners. It cost him his job and earned Tammy Lore a sworn enemy. He claimed he was home all night and didn't get out of bed until after 7 that morning. His wife vouched for him.
And when I interviewed him, I felt that he was being honest, and I was also looking for his wife's reactions because she was kind of standing in the background as I was talking to him, and when he told us where he was and who he was with, I didn't get any kind of reactions from her. We're running south on Bakey.
By now, the major physical clues to the case had been gathered.
Another one of the pictures of the judge.
Still, police had no real suspects and no clear-cut
Well,
motive.
that's a black eye rock.
But their next clue would come from the victim herself. Evansville fire investigators were certain that the fire that destroyed Tammy Lore's house was intentionally set.
Like cut him and twisted him to short him
But the
out.
fire had also apparently destroyed all clues leading to who set it and why. Then the autopsy provided some surprising information. Tammy Lore hadn't died in the fire. She had been stabbed 21 times and had no smoke in her lungs. She had been murdered before the arson. The fire was apparently an effort to hide blatant homicide. The murder was revealed, but investigator Ford thought the murderer might have succeeded in obliterating his identity.
As far as fiber type evidence and things like that, because of the fire, we knew that a lot of that evidence was going to be destroyed. Unfortunately, we would not be able to do the vacuumings of the floor. The search of the bedclothes for hair and fiber of a perpetrator, that was going to be destroyed.
We can take and open this up and test it.
Police hoped that Officer Bradford's uniform might hold some clues the fire destroyed. At the lab, Jesse Story analyzed the uniform for traces of accelerant. Petroleum-based hydrocarbon accelerants are, by their nature, highly volatile. The hydrocarbon detector is sensitively calibrated to electronically sniff for the chemicals as they evaporate. It can detect flammable molecules on the order of 1 part per million. Investigators found no trace of the accelerant on Bradford's uniform. That made sense. He said he crawled into the house and stopped at the bedroom door. The accelerant had been confined to the bedroom, so Bradford wouldn't have picked any up on his clothes. Tests on the bedroom carpet confirmed that it was saturated with it. In the lab, fibers clinging to Bradford's uniform were compared to fibers taken from the victim's home. Bradford's uniform had not a single fiber on it from the house. That was peculiar, considering he said he'd crawled through the home to save Tammy. If Bradford really did crawl across the carpet, he would have had to pick up fibers. Bradford's story started to fray. Investigators felt that he and his wife, Dawn, might know more than they were admitting. Authorities knew that Bradford had been seeing Lore behind his wife's back for 4 years. The affair showed no sign of ending anytime soon. Dawn, who suspected her husband's infidelity, might have seen fit to kill his mistress.
That was a theory that was popular amongst many citizens here in Evansville. They thought that Dawn killed Tammy and that Patrick set the fire to cover up the murder that his wife had committed.
Polygraphs were ordered for Patrick and Dawn Bradford. The test measures the changes in heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure that often occur when a person isn't telling the truth. Dawn passed the lie detector test, showing no prior knowledge of the crime, and was cleared as a suspect. Patrick's results were deemed inconclusive. Another test was scheduled for the following week. Police continued to gather interviews to get a clearer picture of what happened at Tammy Lohr's house.
Maybe you'd like to talk with me. Sure do. Hi, Mr. Trey. We'll just have a seat over here at my desk. Over here.
Her neighbor said that Bradford, apparently distracted, almost ran into him pulling into the driveway that morning. They greeted each other. Bradford didn't seem frantic, and the neighbor said he didn't see any smoke. Other witnesses said they drove by the house that morning, saw Bradford's car in the driveway, and also didn't see smoke. By the time the fire engines arrived, 3 minutes, 40 seconds after Bradford made the call, the fire had ravaged the bedroom. Based on the type of fire it was, a mattress doused in gasoline, investigators knew that it burned fast and created blinding amounts of smoke. It couldn't have been on fire long prior to Officer Bradford's arrival. But the larger question was, did it actually start after he arrived? Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, for one, thought Bradford's statement about his rescue attempt was just a smokescreen.
His description was that he saw flames 6 to 12 inches high and the tips breaking off whenever he got to the bedroom door was not very feasible to us because we knew what the heat and smoke conditions were whenever accelerant is used in a compartmentalized area such as this bedroom. And it was our contention that had he got that far inside the house, that he definitely would have been overcome by smoke if not killed.
Determining if Bradford had actually set the fire required a down-to-the-second reconstruction of the events that morning. In order to prove Bradford had time to burn the house, Minnis began to create a detailed timeline of the suspect's activity. He realized Bradford would have had to drive past an ATM on his way to Tammy Lohr's house. Its camera faced the street. Detective Minnis requested a copy of the ATM tape for the morning of the fire. Sure enough, it showed Bradford's car driving in the direction of Lohr's house at 6:34 a.m. "65 seconds later, he called the fire department. Minnis, stopwatch in hand, retraced Bradford's route. It took him only 18 seconds to go from the ATM to the victim's house.
When I drove the route, I found that Bradford could commit the crime of arson in the 65 seconds that he had, from the time that he drove by the ATM until the time that he called in the fire on his walkie-talkie. He had plenty of time to pour out the gasoline, set it on fire, and then call the fire in.
But arson was only part of the story. He couldn't have had enough time to kill Tammy Lohr, tamper with the electricity and phone, stage a break-in, and then set the fire. That part of the story had yet to be told. Investigators hoped that Patrick Bradford would tell it. He kept his appointment for his second polygraph test and was asked questions specific to the staging of the scene. He denied involvement. He failed.
The sergeant and I both interviewed Patrick Bradford at that time once we knew that he had failed the polygraph test. And that's when I knew for certain that we had the right guy.
Now, investigators had to prove it. The current timeline didn't allow enough time for Bradford to murder Tammy. They reasoned that just because the fire was started in the morning didn't mean that that was when the murder took place. The condition of the body made time of death impossible to determine. But Tammy had spoken to her father on the phone at 10:30 the night before the fire.
You can kind of see right there.
So she was murdered between then and 6:30 the next morning.
Underneath the kitchen window where the tarp area was set up.
Investigators looked into Officer Bradford's timesheets the night before the fire. They found one gap in his report. Shortly before 11 p.m., he radioed in that he needed to run some errands. Then there was a break of about an hour when he could not be accounted for.
Patrick, of course, told us that he never went by the house at any point in time during that evening, other than when he was going to work in his personal car and he stopped by to see Tammy for a few minutes. Then he continued on to work and got his police car.
Working with this new time frame, detectives went back to their files. They re-interviewed neighbors about what they might have seen. One woman was driving above the speed limit through the neighborhood and saw a police cruiser parked at the victim's house. She checked her speed and slowed down. It was around 11 p.m. Evansville investigators had now placed Bradford at the house the night before and proved he had enough time to commit murder. They felt they'd gathered enough evidence against one of their own. Officer Patrick Bradford was arrested for the murder of Tammy Lohr. As for motive, lately Bradford and Lohr were having difficulties. Police surmised that on the night of August 1st, the two had an argument that was settled by murder. The passerby had placed Bradford at the scene, and his logbook showed he had the opportunity. He returned to the house the following morning, as was his habit. Only this was to be the last time. He finished what he'd started, pouring the gasoline and striking the match. Patrick Bradford was convicted of murder and arson. He was sentenced to 80 years. Murders, like clandestine love affairs, require an elaborate deception. But that level of deceit can seldom bear close scrutiny. It's easy to see how a place like Farmville gets its name. The little community of about 6,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills of central Virginia, retains its rural charm in a fast-paced world. But even a quiet town like this is not immune to tragedy. On December 11, 1991, just after 1 p.m., Farmville police received a call about a shooting at the home of Robert Bruce. Detective Jack Bryant was dispatched to the scene. Though shootings are uncommon here, this one wasn't totally unexpected.
I was driving on South Main Street. I received a radio call from the dispatcher to go to 600 High Street. There had been a shooting, and my immediate reaction was that Mr. Bruce had shot himself because he was scheduled for sentencing on an embezzlement charge.
Farmville police began the case with an assumption. An assumption that proved wrong the instant Robert Bruce answered the door. They were surprised to find that Robert Bruce wasn't the victim. They were even more surprised to learn that it was his wife, Carol, who had apparently committed suicide. Robert Bruce told detectives that he and Carol had an argument that morning.
Half hour, 45 minutes ago maybe.
He took their children to school, returned to the house for a brief period, and then left to go to an appointment at the bank.
I don't know.
When he returned home, he found her dead. Carol Bruce lay on the sofa in the den, a bullet to her head. Any crime scene, even a suicide, must be thoroughly documented. Before anything was touched or moved, every inch was photographed and measured. The room was much warmer than the rest of the house, and the victim was covered with an Afghan. A .32 caliber Colt revolver lay on the carpet. The victim's hand was thrust awkwardly into a gardening glove. Though it appeared to be a suicide, these details raised doubts in Detective Bryant's mind.
And the glove was just partially on the hand. It wasn't on a hand as someone would normally put a glove on.
Investigators compiled a growing list of troubling details. They noted that the gun was more than 2 feet from the victim's trigger hand, and that the overheated room would change the body temperature and thwart attempts to gauge an accurate time of death. It all seemed too suspicious. Detectives began to doubt that Carol Bruce took her own life. They feared she might have had help. In Farmville, Virginia, as Detective Bryant investigated the mysterious death of Carol Bruce, he began to suspect that she had been murdered. To prove it, he started with the gun. A trace of the serial number revealed that it was local. He went to talk with the owner. It had been reported stolen to Detective Bryant 5 months earlier, taken out of a car in the Bruce's neighborhood. The owner made no secret of the fact that he kept the gun in his vehicle. But he had no idea how it ended up in Carol Bruce's hand. At the morgue, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim was killed by a single bullet to the brain. It entered the right temple and lodged in the lower left portion of her head. But the autopsy couldn't explain who fired it.
The initial results of the autopsy was that it was a routine suicide. And the department did not actually make a ruling on it. The chief left that to me to do. And any time that I was contacted about it, I just said it has not been ruled a suicide or a homicide. Is still under investigation.
The gun and the slug retrieved from the victim's skull were sent to the Virginia State Crime Lab. There, the gun was test-fired. The water chamber stops the bullet without adding extraneous marks. Usually, that allows investigators to compare the test-fired bullet with ones at a crime scene. But in this case, the lands and grooves of the crime scene bullet were too faint to be read. As a formality, investigators examined the cartridge casing taken from the scene with one test fired in the lab. By comparing the markings on the 2 casings, technicians determined that the fatal shot was fired from the weapon found near the victim. Less certain was who fired it. Detective Bryant had some doubts. Bryant wasn't alone in his suspicions.
I appreciate you coming in.
Carol's friends had told him that even though Carol and Robert were having marital problems, she was excited about planning her future. Carol taught physical education at the local college and was preparing to earn her doctorate. Then, 3 days before she was scheduled to take her graduate school exam, she was found dead. Carol's friends also told Bryant that the idea she shot herself seemed unlikely.
She was petrified of any type of guns. She just didn't allow them in the house. So that was another thing I couldn't believe. Number one, I couldn't believe that she would have stolen it to begin with. And number two, certainly that she would not have killed herself with it.
There had been no sign of an intruder in the house, so if it wasn't suicide, the most logical suspect was Robert Bruce, the beneficiary of his wife's $100,000 life insurance policy.
You have a lovely day.
Bruce had been an attorney, but he'd just been convicted of embezzling $30,000 from his clients and forced to pay restitution. He needed the money. Carol had contacted a divorce attorney to end their 16-year marriage. Her lawyer requested that Robert send him his financial records. But he hadn't filed his taxes for 5 years. After Carol's death, Robert Bruce was sentenced to several months in jail for embezzling. While he was incarcerated, the death investigation continued. Bryant had established a possible motive, but what of the opportunity? He was determined to get some resolution to this mystery.
This case just stayed on my mind all the time. I could wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and this case was on my mind just as strong as it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It just stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and I knew it had to come to an end somewhere.
Bryant consulted his notes from Bruce's interview to reconstruct his movements on the morning of his wife's death. The school had a record of him dropping off his kids first thing. Then, Bruce said he puttered around the rental apartments he owned, but nobody saw him there. Then he had a meeting at the bank with an attorney. Investigators spoke with the attorney, who said that he had met with Robert Bruce that morning between 11 o'clock and 12 noon. Bruce left immediately after the meeting. His movements afterward were vouched for by his cousin's wife. She worked in an apparel shop, and Bruce stopped by to chat a while, as he frequently did. He left around 1 o'clock and returned home, where his wife lay dead.
As far as his whereabouts for the day, we had roughly from 9 to 11 that he could not actually prove where he was at. All of the other times he had witnesses.
That gap could have given Bruce the opportunity to kill his wife. Now, Bryant hoped forensics could prove she had died in that time frame. For help, he contacted Virginia State Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro. But estimating the time of death would be tricky.
Time of death is always an estimate. It's an estimate made based on when the person was last reliably seen alive, and the operative word there is reliably, and when the person was found.
Although Carol Bruce's body temperature suggested she died shortly before the police arrived, rigor mortis had already begun to set in. That typically takes several hours.
It appeared that she was dead for more hours than was reported.
In fact, Fierro's time of death estimate correlated with Robert Bruce's window of opportunity. Investigators faced one last challenge. Bruce's motive and opportunity were now firmly established. In order to prove that he pulled the trigger, they had to first prove that the victim couldn't possibly have pulled it herself. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Forensic Science Supervisor Ann Davis ran a trigger pull test to see if Carol Bruce, while partially wearing a gardening glove, fired the gun that ended her life. Davis added progressively more weight to the trigger to determine how much pressure the shooter would need to squeeze off a round. Tests determined that it would take at least 9 1/4 pounds of finger pressure to pull the trigger. Hampered by the glove, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to manage it. After the trigger pull test, Firearm and Toolmark Section Chief Jim Pickleman approached the case from another angle. He reconstructed the crime scene based on photos, and he constructed a mannequin and a dummy head to replicate the fatal bullet's trajectory. He found that the angle of the shot would have been too awkward for the victim to manage on her own. and the powder burns indicated that the gun was pushed directly against her head, which wasn't typical. The tests proved that the distance of the gun and the trajectory of the bullet were inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. Investigators finally had the proof they needed. Carol Bruce did not pull that trigger. In May 1993, Robert Bruce, having served his time for embezzling, was arrested again for murder. Police surmised that on the morning of her death, Carol had fallen asleep on the sofa. Robert came in with the gun stolen several months earlier. He turned up the thermostat to distort time of death estimates. He donned a glove to keep his own hands clean. Then he killed his wife with a single bullet, staged the scene to look like a suicide, covered her with a blanket, and slipped the glove awkwardly onto her hand.
The Bruce case represents a special kind of situation in forensic pathology. We call these masquerades. These are deaths where what you are seeing is not really what happened, and someone is trying to arrange a death to look like a death, a type of death which it is not.
Ultimately, Robert Bruce was unmasked by forensics. For his crime, he was sentenced to life. In masquerade deaths, investigators follow the evidence down two trails. One leads to the cause of death. The other, more twisted trail leads to the killer. Around 10 p.m. on June 12, 1994, police were called to the scene of a car accident on a secluded road in Little Mountain, South Carolina. A woman had apparently driven off the road and crashed. She was dead at the scene. Yet, strangely, her vehicle was barely scratched. Officers of SLED, the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division, processed the vehicle. They found drops of blood in the back seat, damage to the car's interior, and the gear was in neutral. A footprint on the rear passenger side window suggested a violent struggle. Newberry, South Carolina Sheriff Lee Foster knew this was more than a tragic accident.
We noticed that there was absolutely no damage done to the vehicle, and certainly nothing that would have caused the blood or the injuries to the body. So all of those items in connection, I mean, it was obviously it wasn't a traffic accident. It looked like something else had happened.
Only after the obvious clues were documented did the investigators search for the driver's identification. She was Victoria Beckham. Authorities had done all they could at the scene. While her family was notified, the victim was removed and the car towed to the SLED laboratory for closer scrutiny. Police notified Stephen Beckham about his wife's death and their suspicions of foul play. He immediately came to the station to answer questions. He said he'd seen Vicky around 6:15 that evening when she dropped the kids off at his house. Vicky was separated from her husband and had moved back in with her parents. She and Stephen shared custody of their 3 children. Since the separation, she'd gotten a job and was preparing to sue Stephen for full custody. The autopsy confirmed suspicions of foul play. Vicky Beckham was shown to have blunt force trauma to her head and neck. The medical examiner determined that she'd been killed by asphyxiation due to a crushed windpipe. Whatever crushed it left unusual and unrecognizable markings. This was not the kind of injury one would sustain in a car accident. Because her body was already beginning to cool and stiffen when it was discovered at 10 p.m., her time of death was estimated to have been around 6:30, shortly after leaving her husband's house.
Stephen Beckham was the last person to have seen her alive. The investigators narrowed it down to the fact that she delivered the children, he saw her, and we needed to follow up further on that.
Because Beckham's house was the last place the victim had been seen alive, officers obtained a warrant to search it. They found nothing but a tennis shoe with what appeared to be a single drop of blood. That wasn't necessarily unusual, unless the blood happened to be from the murder victim. The tennis shoe was sent to the State Law Enforcement Division Forensic Laboratory, where forensic serologist Nancy Skraba tested it. First, she removed the stain with a cotton swab dampened with saline solution. Then she tested the swab by adding phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide. The chemical combination reacts with the hemoglobin in blood and turns pink. To prove it was blood, and more specifically human blood, Skraba used a process called crossover electrophoresis, which isolated the proteins and revealed them to be human. Unfortunately, the sample wasn't large enough to reveal the blood type. The same couldn't be said for the victim's car. Copious blood samples were collected from the front and back seat areas and also from the exterior rear door. All were tested and all were type A, the same as the victim's. Forensics had another tool in its arsenal. After the blood, fibers, and other samples were collected, the vehicle was processed for latent fingerprints. Fingerprinting is always the last step because the processes used to reveal latent prints can destroy other evidence. More than 30 prints or partial prints were eventually raised on the car. Many belonged to the Beckhams, some belonged to rescue workers, and most were difficult to read. SLED Senior Agent David Warren Black knew he had his work cut out for him.
They're not the pristine, picture-perfect thing that you would see. They were torqued, they were smeared, they were smudged. They're partial fragmentary impressions. Some may have even been the size, say, of a pencil eraser.
And each had to be compared against a database of hundreds and hundreds of known prints. It would take some time. But investigators were encouraged by the discovery of a partial smeared print stamped in blood on the car's exterior.
The fact that the print was in blood placed that print being put there after bloodletting occurred. So it could have only gotten placed there after Mrs. Beckham was assaulted.
While the print was being analyzed, police returned to the murder scene and stopped motorists to see if anyone driving by on the night of the murder might have witnessed anything. Several reported seeing a gold-colored car parked near the scene earlier that day. Sheriff Lee Foster felt the vehicle could be crucial.
The car was an important factor because it could have been involved in the murder, or it could have been somebody that witnessed it.
None who'd seen it could recall its make, model, or license number. Then, one man pulled over. He'd gotten a good look at it.
He said it was definitely a Pontiac. It was a Pontiac Grand Prix, and it was gold color, and he even went as far as talk about the type of wheels that it had on the car.
I said I had one just like it was the only year they made that.
And he said he knew it was a Pontiac Grand Prix because he had had a car earlier in his life similar to that, just not the same color. And he went on to tell us that the gold color was a very distinctive gold, that he didn't know that General Motors made a car that color anymore.
A check of motor vehicle records revealed hundreds of Grand Prix, but the database couldn't break them down by color. Far too many to check. A year passed with few leads and no real suspects. The paper and TV news did follow-up pieces on Vicki Beckham's murder. They focused on the gold car, apparently the only clue, and asked the public for information about it.
How we doing today, Earl? I'm doing all right.
The reports jump-started the memory of an acquaintance of Stephen Beckham's. He told detectives that Stephen was a regular at a Myrtle Beach strip club, and a gold Grand Prix was parked in front of the club most of the time. Investigators checked the DMV dead file and found an expired registration for a 1980 Grand Prix that was owned by the proprietor of the strip club. Investigators also checked Beckham's phone records and found that he had made hundreds of calls to payphones in Myrtle Beach and to the strip club in the weeks prior to the murder. It was time to pay a visit to the owner of the club and bring along a search warrant. The proprietor admitted the car was his, but told investigators that a year earlier he'd loaned it to one of his bouncers, a man named Richard Anderson. The police had the car towed to the lab, where they could get a better look at it. The crime happened over a year earlier, and investigators weren't certain this was the car they were looking for. Nevertheless, they combed it for clues. In the trunk, they raised fingerprints that didn't match the owner's.
Never seen her before in my life.
Police found the bouncer, Richard Anderson. He agreed to take a polygraph regarding his involvement with the Beckham murder. He denied knowing Beckham or anything about the murder. He failed. Investigators broke the news to him.
Anderson decided that he didn't want to cooperate anymore, but would give us hair, blood, and other forensic samples to conduct DNA testing because we were looking into the forensic aspect of the case as well.
But on the way to the hospital, Anderson requested that he be taken to the Attorney General's office. He had a confession to make. Richard Anderson, the key suspect in the murder of Vicki Beckham, decided to come clean. His confession revealed he was part of a deadly plan.
Anderson told us that he was contracted to kill Vicki Beckham because of the situation that was going on between Stephen and Vicki. His stories changed from time to time, but it never changed the fact that he was contracted by Stephen Beckham to get rid of the body.
Anderson said that the weekend before the murder, he and Beckham met face-to-face to finalize their plans. Prior to that, they had planned much of the murder through a series of telephone calls at prearranged locations. These locations matched Beckham's phone records. Beckham's plan was to murder Vicki after she came to his house to drop off the kids. She was supposed to be dead when Beckham delivered her to Anderson. But she was merely unconscious after Beckham had pistol-whipped her. Anderson was able to describe the gun that Beckham used for the beating. Anderson admitted that after Beckham left, he killed the victim with a bolt cutter, then staged the car accident. At the lab, technicians looked for evidence to prove that Anderson's story was true. Bolt cutters found in his house were analyzed for trace evidence. None was found, but the pathologist determined that the fatal injury was consistent with being struck by the tool. Anderson's fingerprints were compared to those found on the gold Grand Prix and the car where Vicki was found murdered. They matched. Investigators had enough to arrest Stephen Beckham and search his house. When they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. However, they did find a handgun like the one Anderson described. Forensics determined that the marks on the victim's head were consistent with characteristics of the handgun. Investigators had placed Anderson at the scene. They used the phone records to link Beckham to the crime. Stephen Beckham was arrested 4 days later in Chapin, South Carolina. According to Anderson's statements and what investigators could piece together, Vicky dropped the kids off at Stephen's house. Stephen somehow persuaded her to take a short drive with him. When they got to a secluded, prearranged place, Stephen stopped the vehicle. He beat Vicky into unconsciousness, then delivered her to Anderson. But she wasn't dead. When Anderson saw she was alive, he finished the job. Then he staged the accident. Detective Foster believed that Stephen bitterly resented Vicky's newfound independence and success. He had lost control of her and was in danger of losing his children. To keep his kids, he needed his wife out of the way.
He had previously convinced Vicky that she was never going to get custody of the children, but now she realized that that wasn't true. So there was going to be a hard custody battle going on.
For the murder of Vicky Beckham, Richard Anderson and Stephen Beckham were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Murderers often believe that they can hide their crimes behind a simple lie. In reality, they're only lying to themselves. The truth is in the evidence, and the evidence is always stacked against the false witness.